Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Andrew Callaghan of Channel 5 had on Nick Shirley. Nick Shirley is the kid who made the video about fraud in Minnesota, connecting it with Somali immigrants. But this was before the surge of ICE into Minnesota. So because of this video by Nick Shirley, ICE has been surged into Minnesota, and now we are seeing all of this chaos happening there, the protests happening, Renee Nicole Good being shot in the face, all that happened after this video, as well as Tim Walz dropping out of the governor's race. So this video genuinely made a huge impact, and it's not all fake, although there's really not that much journalism happening with the video. He is going to these daycare centers and raising, in some cases, some interesting questions about whether some of these centers are ever actually open. But at the same time, this is a guy making YouTube videos, so there's no real journalistic standard here. And it's impossible to know how much of the confusion here is based on actual fraud and how much of it is kind of drummed up by right-wingers. But there is definitely some fraud going on here, no question about it. Enough so that Tim Walz looked at the situation and said, there's no way I can continue to defend what happened on my watch while also running for another term. But it's also conflated with fraud that has already been litigated, which is this organization called Feed Our Future, and that was also in Minnesota, and that litigation began under the Biden administration. So that investigation has also kind of spiraled into the investigations that we are now seeing happen. So Andrew Callaghan sat down with this kid to talk to him about his video, how he made it, the sort of aftermath and the implications of it all. And then shortly after that video was released, this kid started crying, saying that Andrew deceptively edited it and cut stuff out to make Nick Shirley look dumb. Now, there was several viral clips from this, mainly one where he can't say the word benevolent correctly, and he just really doesn't speak very articulately. I think this kid was homeschooled from like a Mormon household or something. They touch on that a little bit. Andrew Callaghan came back out and said most of what he cut out of the interview was cut for clarity because the kid stumbles a lot, and he basically cleaned up all the points that the kid was trying to make and pretty much included all of it except for stuff that wasn't related to the topic. But at this point, the full interview has been released by Nick Shirley on his like side channel or something like that, so you can watch it if you want to. It is pretty boring. I watched most of that one and the full Andrew Callaghan video. They're really not that different. They do get into some debates about immigration stuff, but the substance of it related to the video Nick Shirley made and the impact of it is pretty straightforward. Here's the clip of Andrew Callaghan responding to Nick Shirley's allegations that he deceptively edited the video, and including some reasons why and some of his editing methods. And then I'll show you a couple clips from the original interview that show that this kid was essentially just used as a right-wing op, whether he knows it or not.
So when we're dealing with a long-form interview of somebody who talks very slowly and circles back to repetitive talking points, one of the first things that we do in post-production is cutting what's called dead air, which means long pauses between words or sentences or fixable verbal stammers that slow down the conversation and risk boring the viewer. So in this raw interview with Nick, which had a total runtime of 2 hours and 2 minutes, we had to cut nearly half an hour of dead air to make it listenable. Many people like to choose their words carefully, so I get it, but there was a couple points in the interview that even in person we had to have Nick repeat himself because the crew felt that no amount of corrective editing would possibly be able to make him sound normal.
It's been an interesting few days, past 72 hours. My video on the expose of the fraud in Minnesota is the most viewed video ever, longer than 10 minutes, other than Mr. Beast.
Can you say the fraud in Minnesota again? Because you kind of stuttered.
Yeah. Wait, are there going to be cuts in this, or just going to be one take?
Which will make it perfect. So if we ask for to say it again, it's just to make sure you say it perfectly.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, So my video on the fraud in Minnesota.
And 6 whole, nearly identical back and forths about his 89% statistic that he falls back on when challenged.
89% of the fraud is being committed by Somalians, and 89% of the fraud being committed inside Minnesota is by the Somalian population. 89% of the fraud happening by people who were brought into our country and then committing fraud. So 89% of the fraud happening in Minnesota is from the Somali population.
Right, but 95% of Somali Americans in Minnesota are legal.
Yeah, 89% of Somalians are committing fraud.
If you guys saw, the clip that did the most rounds was when Nick tried and failed to pronounce the word benevolent. Who do you think are the 3 most benevolent billionaires?
What do you mean by the word benevolent?
Just well-intentioned, positive billionaires who you think are creating, net positive societal progress.
Trump? Our president?
Because he never said it right and said benevolent twice, there was no way to cut the dead air or trim the stammer, so we left it in, and personally, I don't think it's that big of a deal to not know that word. I mean, he is wearing a hoodie that is making fun of immigrants for their spelling errors, but benevolent has more syllables than learning, so I get it. But the comments on this clip were brutal, like actually genuinely mean, and it couldn't have felt good from his perspective to read these things. So the second clip that Nick posted really makes my blood boil because it is so disingenuous. As I mentioned, 6 or 7 times in this interview, Nick references the stat that 89% of fraud in Minnesota is committed by Somalis. We aired the version where we asked him to show us the data on his phone, which he found using Google search results powered by ChatGPT. So in the video he posted, you can see me look in the camera after he shows it to me and saying something like, "All right, damn, I guess he's right then. Let's put that on screen." The stat refers specifically to the already litigated Feeding Our Future case, which resulted in over 60 fraud convictions in Minnesota. The ringleader of the nonprofit behind the scam, Amy Bach, is white, but it is true that 89% of convicted defendants in that case were Somali. And that's what makes me so pissed about this particular piece of evidence that Nick presents. The exact thing that he is showing me on his phone in the video is what I put on screen on the final cut. I did exactly what I said I would. He frames my decision to put that on screen as some kind of liberal ball-busting fact check, but it's actually supplemental context for something he is literally
so
showing
Andrew is
me.
basically saying here that he did not cut anything out that was meant to make the kid look worse, and in fact tried to help him, tried to make his point more clear. And even in the cases where Nick said that he was trying to be a dick by fact checking him or something, he was actually just corroborating what Nick had told him. This statistic about 89% of fraud committed in Minnesota is Somalians. That was a point that Andrew Callaghan was challenging him on in the interview, but Nick Shirley pulls that up, some AI thing that Andrew Callaghan also cites. But I believe that statistic is in reference to the case that was already litigated. So that is important, that under Biden and up through till now, this Feed Our Future case had been litigated, and that's where this number of most of those people being Somali came from. Although the person running that operation, the main person who got charged, was a white lady in Minnesota. So those distinctions are important because the reality is they're really blowing this up in terms of the fraud that was found in Minnesota, and billions of dollars, etc. And yet we don't really know that to be the case. We don't know how much it is, and there does seem to be some fraud there. My prediction, as usually is the case with this stuff, is they'll go through a huge, extensive investigation and then come up with less than what they're promising us all of this is. That's exactly what happened with Doge. That's usually what happens with these pushes for fraud in government programs, which there is sometimes, and it does seem like in these particular programs they were letting some fraud go for quite a while. But the fraud that was connected to COVID money basically is the Feed Our Future stuff that has been settled essentially. So one of the main things that Nick Shirley keeps saying in the original interview is, when was the last time you've heard of somebody making such an impact with their video, right? Like, I posted this video and then instantly it makes this huge impact. All these millions of billions of people saw it. And then the main accomplishment that he lists is that they froze the funding to Minnesota over this. All funding for these programs to Minnesota has been frozen, and saying that as though that's a positive thing. So to me, that would have been a good opportunity for Andrew Callaghan to say, well, wait a second. I get that there is fraud happening and we want that to stop. So in that instance, it makes sense to say freeze that money. No more money is going towards those supposedly fraudulent programs, though we don't know how many there are or to what extent. But also, is that really an accomplishment? You're freezing money that's going to daycares in Minnesota? Even if 50% of the daycares in Minnesota are totally fraudulent, that's still like hundreds of thousands of kids that are going to be harmed by the fact that this funding has been frozen. And so, it's a good thing to make sure that money isn't going to fraud, but it seems pretty clear that the Republican method of handling that is to stop all funding, because really that's what they want in the first place, is to freeze the funding in general. And so that's really, I think, the operating factor here, is that this kid both agrees with, but also doesn't quite realize how his video is being used to political ends that kind of go beyond him, really have nothing to do with this fraud that he's talking about and whether or not it's actually true or accurate. Once this is all said and done and investigated and whoever is going to be charged is charged, none of this shit is going to matter. Nick Shirley is going to have posted 100 more videos by that point and probably going to continue to get boosted by Elon Musk and the like. So they never really have to check for accuracy. They just put this shit out there. It brought a lot of attention to this. And on the Republican side, the results of that is they're just cutting funding for daycares in Minnesota in general. So obviously that's not much of an accomplishment unless what you want is to destroy the daycare system in general of Minnesota, absent of any fraud. If that's not what you're trying to do, there's probably better ways of going about that. So in these clips from the original interview that I'll show you here, Andrew Callaghan is trying to make that point to this kid, that the timing of this and the way this video was used kind of indicates that there's a political agenda at play here. And the reality is there always is. There's always some kind of journalistic bias, no matter what exactly you're investigating, especially if it's being put out on some kind of large platform. But with this independent media, and even as Nick Shirley says himself here, that's not really how it's supposed to work. The point is supposed to be that you're an independent voice that doesn't have an agenda behind you. So Andrew Callaghan kind of gently points out to him that aside from what I said about the ultimate result of this being the freezing of funding to Minnesota, which is not only crippling daycare there, but also is a political weapon against Democrats there. But also Andrew asks him some questions about where he got this information, the source information that inspired him to do this video in the first place. So here's that.
How did you come into contact with David?
He just messaged me on Instagram and he said, Nick, I have the information about the fraud taking place here inside Minnesota. I've been looking into it for years. I have somebody from inside the Capitol who has given me the numbers of CCAP funding. I've been trying for years to expose this fraud. Nobody will listen to me. Please give me a call.
Has he shown you that data?
Yeah, that's what's inside the video. When you see the video and the screenshots of the CCAP funding, that's all straight from the Capitol of Minnesota.
So who is David's source?
David's source, he has somebody inside the Capitol.
And you don't know who it is?
And that's public information as well.
Who is it?
Who is the person's name?
Yeah.
The lady's name, I did not work with her. However, the information that was provided, I can't tell you her name right now, but I could find it on X but she's also inside the government there inside Minnesota.
But you like fact checked all that and you looked it all up?
Yeah, David, all those numbers are straight from the Capitol.
So a couple days ago, Minnesota State Representative Lisa DeMuth said that her Republican caucus had been, quote, working with you ahead of your coverage. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I had no idea who she was.
Our caucus has been working to expose fraud for years, including working with Nick Shirley.
Minnesota House GOP leaders say they provided the YouTuber with information in the now viral video.
So you feel like she's just clout chasing?
Yeah, that's what I literally put in the reply in the tweet. Her campaign freaked out when I tweeted that. That's the lady who I was referring to earlier in this interview. So her staff was the people that David had received the information from because David reached out, and she works inside the government. So she did actually a good job by doing what she's supposed to do, by serving the people and giving that information.
Yeah, it says that Harry Niska, a Republican representative who's a staffer for her, was the one who gave the intel to David.
Yeah, that probably sounds about right. Every single time they bring up Nick Shirley on these news sites or the internet or on their TV, they'll say right-wing YouTuber, MAGA YouTuber, conservative. It's never journalist Nick Shirley. It's right-wing journalist Nick Shirley.
I'm just talking about if you look at Google Trends specifically, like the phrase Somali fraud was borderline non-existent. It just so happens to really kick up through your piece on December 16th.
Yeah.
Which is the exact same day that the Trump administration and Kash Patel released the redacted Epstein files list that by all people was seen as like a disaster with hundreds of pages of blacked out stuff. Was there a part of you that was curious if maybe there was people in the GOP who chose to signal boost your piece as wide and far as possible in a way to distract and move the goalpost away from that?
I don't know. Like if that was their initiative,
yeah, so he says he got this information from a random guy who hit him up, DM'd him, said, I've been trying to expose fraud for years. And Andrew says, well, where's that guy getting his information from? Shirley says, I don't know. I kind of forgot. It came from the Capitol. He keeps saying that. This came straight from the Capitol. So it turns out that this was a staffer that worked for a Republican in Minnesota that passed this information, I think, through this guy that ended up passing it to Nick Shirley. So to the extent that there is real information in the video that Nick Shirley made, that's where it came from. It came directly from the Republican Party of Minnesota. So that doesn't mean it's not accurate automatically, but it does mean clearly there's an agenda here, and that Nick Shirley's video is essentially a product of people who have been trying to make the case for freezing funding to Minnesota for years. So now Nick has been used effectively as a tool to that end. And Callaghan also makes this interesting point about how the exact day that this video got boosted was the day that they released those bullshit Epstein files, and everybody was freaking out over that, and kind of poses the question to him, do you think that this video kind of was boosted as a way to take attention away from that? And he says, well, if it was, then it probably worked pretty well. Doesn't really have much to say about it other than that. So that is an example of how these kind of echo chambers that we live in work, especially on a larger coordinated basis where they know that this Epstein stuff is going to ring through many channels of the internet and the media, so they have to put something out there that's going to counter that and take the narrative in a different direction, which it has done. Not only did that information distract a lot of Republicans and become one of the more oxygen-stealing stories in American media at the moment, but it also led to this surge of ICE in Minnesota, which led to the murder of Renee Nicole Good, which is leading to this increased protest and the intense scrutiny that is on ICE and Trump and Minnesota at the moment. So, I mean, that's how the game goes. And I'm not saying all of it was perfectly coordinated and planned, but certainly they used the pressure points that they needed to use at certain moments to boost this, and kind of just handed this kid the information that he ended up passing along through his video. Everything else in the video is him just going around to random daycare centers and kind of just harassing people and saying, well, isn't the fact that they don't want to talk to me evidence of something? And then also in that clip there, complains about how he's only ever viewed as a right-wing YouTuber or journalist and not an actual journalist. And here he says that he got this information from the Republican Party of Minnesota. Again, that doesn't invalidate the information automatically, but it does mean that there's a clear bias here, and everything that Nick Shirley put out there and the results of it have been along party lines, along partisan lines of what the Republican Party wants people to be paying attention to. So as of now, Walz and Fry, the governor and the mayor in Minnesota and Minneapolis, respectively, have been subpoenaed by the Department of Justice. This is over whether or not they obstructed ICE's operations. So this is part of like an escalation that's going on there. I personally don't really think that's going anywhere, but it could, from what some people that were subpoenaed in that round have said. They were just seeking documentation from these offices. So that's probably all it is for right now when it comes to Walz and Fry. And we'll see if there's something that they can use to say that they obstructed, then they might, but I have a feeling that's just not going to go anywhere. It's an intimidation tactic. And you actually now see the Trump administration and ICE on the defensive a little bit. This Nazi troop leader guy, Greg Bovino, has to go on the news and say that what we're doing is ethical and lawful, and it's not political. He's giving them cover. Same thing that J.D. Vance did when he went out and said that all of these agents have absolute immunity, which is also not true. Vance is going to be there on Thursday, coincidentally the day before the general strike was called in Minnesota, and he's going to be talking to a roundtable of leaders, probably to get them not to do this general strike thing, although I doubt they're too worried about that yet. This is only a one-day strike thing that they're trying to do. At worst, that's going to call more attention to this situation, which wouldn't necessarily be devastating for the administration. administration. But if it turns into a real strike with real momentum, which it is starting to pick up momentum, that could actually be something that does a lot of damage to the administration's narrative and to their political capital. So we'll see what happens on Friday. Chances are good that this is just going to be a one-day thing, but I think if there's any way to push it beyond that, they should do it and let Trump's threats of sending in whoever he wants to send in, the National Guard or the Marines or whatever, let them do it, because at a certain point, escalation around this tension point of ICE is good, because this comes back to the central conceit of the Trump administration, what it's always been about, which is removing as many brown immigrants from the country as possible. So as whatever we can do to keep the narrative there and to keep applying political pressure there, which up until now we have had no way of doing so, is good and will help rebalance and refocus the political conversation for this upcoming midterm election. Whatever's going to happen there. You already have Democrats now debating over whether or not to use the language abolish ICE, and the ones who are willing to say abolish ICE seems to be getting received better by the Democratic base. So this is a pattern we should be familiar with, shouldn't be too comfortable with it yet, but it looks like Friday could be a major turning point and inflection point, not just in this Minnesota deployment, but in the general public conversation in America.
Me too close to, too much to do. The mission is too crucial. Shout it out from the rooftops until I lose vocals. Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity.